The halls of Galactic Concord Station stretched upward like the inside of a massive cathedral. And Ambassador Kale Reyes felt very small walking through them. He stood barely 1.7 meters tall, which was average for a human male but practically microscopic compared to the beings around him. A Vorthani delegate passed him on the left, a crystalline exoskeleton catching the artificial light and scattering rainbows across the polished floor. And she stood nearly 3 meters high with mandibles that could crush stone. Behind her slithered a Sethkai diplomat. His serpentine body coiled and muscular, easily 15 meters long when fully extended, with scales that gleamed like polished emeralds and fangs that dripped with paralytic venom. Kale kept walking, his soft-soled boots making barely any sound against the floor. "Look at it," someone whispered. And Kale did not need to turn around to know they were talking about him. How does such a creature even survive? Another voice answered, this one belonging to a Bracken warrior whose 4 arms were each thicker than Kale's entire body. Their world must be very gentle, the first voice said with a clicking laugh that Kale recognized as Vorthani amusement. He had heard variations of this conversation every single day for the past 3 cycles since Earth had been granted observer status at the Concord Observer. Status meant humanity could watch and learn, but could not vote or participate. In any meaningful way, it was a token gesture, really. A polite way of saying that humans were too primitive and too weak to matter in galactic affairs. The Concord had existed for 10,000 years, and its member species had mastered faster than light travel when humanity was still figuring out how to make fire. Kale understood why they looked down on him. He was small and soft with no natural armor and no claws and no venom and no ability to survive in vacuum or extreme temperatures. His bones were fragile and his skin could be cut by something as simple as a sharp rock by every metric the galaxy used to measure a species. Humans were laughably inadequate, and yet here he was, walking through halls filled with apex predators and ancient civilizations. And he was not afraid. He was fascinated. Kale made his way to the observation deck on Deck 7, his favorite spot on the entire station. The deck featured a massive transparent wall that looked out into the void of space, and he could stand there for hours, watching the ships come and go. He pulled out his tablet and began making notes, recording the conversations he had overheard and the political undercurrents he had sensed during the morning session. The Vorthani were pushing for expanded mining rights in the neutral zone, and the Sethkai were quietly opposing them. And the Bracken were playing both sides, while secretly negotiating with a third party that Kale had not yet identified. These were the patterns that interested him, the invisible webs of alliance and rivalry that determined the fate of civilizations. His superiors back on Earth thought he was wasting his time with this assignment. "You are just there to smile and nod," Admiral Chun had told him before he left. "Do not make waves, do not cause problems, and do not embarrass humanity." Kale had smiled and nodded at that, which seemed appropriate. But he had no intention of simply standing around waiting for humanity to be noticed. He was going to learn everything he could about how the galaxy worked. And then he was going to find a way to make humanity matter. A shadow fell across his tablet, and Kale looked up. A young Vorthani was standing in front of him, her crystal form still showing the cloudy impurities of adolescence. And she was staring at him with what appeared to be a mixture of curiosity and disgust. "You are the human," she said. And it was not a question. "I am," Kale replied. "My brother says your species is barely sentient," the young Vorthani continued. "She says you achieved spaceflight by accident, and that you will destroy yourselves within a few generations." Kale considered this for a moment. "Your brother might be right," he said calmly. "We have come very close to destroying ourselves several times already. This was clearly not the response the young Gorthani had expected. "You admit this?" she asked, her mandibles clicking in confusion. "Of course," Kale said. "It would be foolish to deny the truth, and besides, I think our near-destruction experiences are part of what makes us interesting. How can nearly dying make you interesting?" Kale smiled, and it was a genuine smile, not the diplomatic mask he wore in formal settings. "Because we learned from every single near-death experience," he said. "We came close to nuclear war, and then we learned to fear nuclear weapons enough to mostly avoid using them. And we came close to environmental collapse, and then we learned to take better care of our world. And we came close to destroying ourselves with artificial intelligence. And then we learned to be more careful with how we developed it." He leaned back against the railing and looked out at the stars. "Every time something almost killed us, we got a little bit smarter and a little bit more careful. And now here we are, talking to species that have existed for millions of years. And we have only been spacefaring for a few centuries." The young Vorthani stared at him for a long moment, her crystalline face unreadable. "You are strange," she finally said. "Thank you." Kale replied. She walked away without another word. And Kale returned to his observations, but something else had caught his attention now. Something that had been nagging at the edge of his awareness for the past 3 days. There was a shadow on the observation deck that did not move like the other shadows. It was deeper and darker, and it seemed to absorb light rather than simply blocking it. And it had been there every time Kale visited this spot. He had not mentioned it to anyone because he wanted to understand it first. Whatever was lurking in that shadow was big, much bigger than him, and it moved with the patient stillness of a predator waiting for prey. Kale had grown up on Earth reading stories about predators, about lions and tigers and sharks, and all the creatures that had hunted humanity's ancestors across the savannas and through the forests. He knew what a predator looked like when it was watching potential prey, and he knew that the worst thing you could do was show fear, so he did not show fear. Instead, he turned slightly so that he could keep the shadow in his peripheral vision while still appearing to focus on his tablet. And he continued taking notes as if nothing unusual was happening. The shadow watched him. He watched the shadow. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Kale felt the ancient instincts of his species stirring. The same instincts that had kept humanity alive through millions of years of being hunted by things bigger and stronger and faster than them. Those instincts were not telling him to run. They were telling him to learn. 3 more days passed, and the shadow continued to watch Kale from its hiding place on the observation deck by now. Kale had gathered enough information to know exactly what he was dealing with. The creature lurking in the darkness was a Kethvoran, and that knowledge should have terrified him. The Kethvoran were the apex predators of the known galaxy, a species so dangerous that entire civilizations had been wiped out simply for being in their way. They stood 4 meters tall on average, covered in scales that were harder than most spacecraft armor and darker than the void. Between stars, their claws could tear through bulkheads. Their teeth could crush bones to powder, and their reflexes were so fast that most species could not even see them move before it was too late. They had never been conquered, and they had never needed to conquer anyone else because every other species simply gave them whatever they wanted. The Kethvoran had no formal seat on the Galactic Concord because they did not need one. When it Kethvoran wanted something, they took it. And no one was foolish enough to argue. Kale had spent the past 3 days researching everything he could find about them. He learned that they were ambush predators who preferred to attack from above and behind. And he noticed that the shadow on the observation deck was positioned near a chimnera ventilation shaft that would allow exactly that kind of attack angle. He learned that they could go weeks without eating when they were stalking prey. And he calculated that this particular Cathvorin had been on the station for approximately 6 days without visiting any of the food dispensaries. He learned that they were highly territorial and rarely left their home systems unless something forced them to. And that detail was the most interesting of all. Why would one of the galaxy's most feared predators travel all the way to Concord Station and then hide in the shadows like a frightened animal? On the 7th day, Cale decided it was time to find out. He walked onto the observation deck at his usual time. But instead of taking his usual position by the window, he walked directly toward the shadow. The other beings on the deck scattered immediately, sensing something that their instincts screamed at them to avoid within seconds. Cale was alone except for whatever was lurking in the darkness. Stopped about 5 meters from the shadow and waited for a long moment. Nothing happened. Then the shadow moved to Cathvorin, emerged from the darkness like a nightmare, given physical form. And Cale had to fight every instinct in his body that was screaming at him to run. The creature was even more terrifying up close than the records had suggested. Its scales were not just black, but somehow darker than black, absorbing the light around them and creating an effect that made it hard to focus on the creature's outlines. Eyes burned like molten gold, and they were fixed on Cale with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "You are either very brave or very stupid," the Cathvorin said. And its voice was like grinding stones mixed with distant thunder. "Probably both," Cale admitted. And he was surprised by how steady his own voice sounded. The Cathvorin tilted its massive head, studying him with those burning eyes. "You have been watching me," it said. "You have been watching me too," Cale replied. "I watch everyone," the creature said. "It is what predators do. And yet you have been watching me specifically," Cale continued. "For 7 days now, you have positioned yourself where you can observe my movements. And you have adjusted your hiding spot twice when I changed my routine." The Cathvorin went very still. "How do you know this?" it asked. "Because I was watching you watch me," Cale said. "Your species hunts by ambush, preferring elevated positions with multiple escape routes. And you chose a spot near the ventilation shaft because it gives you both. But you moved on the 3rd day when I started arriving earlier, and you moved again on the 5th day when I changed my position at the window." The creature's eyes narrowed, and Cale could see the muscles in its legs tensing. This was the moment of maximum danger. He knew predators did not like being studied, and they especially did not like prey that studied back. "You are not afraid," the Cathvorin observed, and there was something like confusion in its voice. "I am terrified," Cale said honestly. "My heart is beating so fast right now that I can hear it in my ears, and every cell in my body is telling me to run. But running would not help me because you are faster than me and stronger than me, and you could kill me before I took 3 steps." He met those burning golden eyes directly. "So instead of running, I am going to stand here and talk to you, because talking is the one thing I can do better than you can." For a long moment, the Cathvorin simply stared at him. Then it made a sound that Cale did not recognize at first. A deep rumbling that came from somewhere in its massive chest. It took him several seconds to realize that the creature was laughing. "You are the most interesting prey I have encountered in a very long time," the Cathvorin said. "I would prefer if you did not think of me as prey." Cale said, "What would you prefer I think of you as?" Cale considered the question carefully. "A puzzle," he said finally. "Something that does not fit the patterns you are used to. Something that requires study and thought rather than teeth and claws." The Cathvorin's laughter faded, and something shifted in those golden eyes. "You are correct," it said. "You are a puzzle, and I have been trying to solve you for 7 days now. Have you made any progress?" Cale asked. "I have made no progress at all," the creature admitted. "Every prey species I have ever encountered has reacted to me in one of 2 ways. They either run or they freeze, but you do neither. You observe and analyze and adapt, and I do not understand why, Kale smiled. And it was the same genuine smile he had shown the young Vorthani. That is because I am human, he said. And humans have been prey for a very long time. The Kethvoran leaned closer, and Kale could feel the heat radiating from its massive body. Tell me more, it said, and Kale knew in that moment that something important had just changed. The Kethvoran's name was Vexrath, and his private quarters on the station were unlike anything Kale had ever seen. The space was cavernous and dark, with no furniture in the traditional sense, but rather a series of elevated platforms and hanging structures that allowed the massive predator to move in 3 dimensions. It reminded Kale of videos he had seen of jungle environments back on Earth, where predators like leopards and jaguars would climb trees to survey their territory. Vexrath had invited him here after their conversation on the observation deck, and Kale had accepted without hesitation. Several station security officers had tried to stop him, warning him that no other species had ever been invited into a Kethvoran's personal space and survived. Kale had thanked them for their concern and walked through the door. Anyway, now he sat on one of the lower platforms while Vexrath lounged on a structure above him, those golden eyes gleaming in the dim light. Kale had brought a bottle of whiskey from Earth, and he poured 2 glasses, despite not knowing if Kethvoran could even drink alcohol. Vexrath sniffed the amber liquid suspiciously before taking a careful sip. It burns, he observed. That is part of the appeal. Kale said, your species is strange, Vexrath said. But he took another sip anyway. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and Kale found himself relaxing despite the fact that he was sharing drinks with a creature that could kill him in a heartbeat. You said on the observation deck that humans have been prey for a very long time, Vexrath finally said. I want you to explain what you meant by that. Kale nodded and took a sip of his own whiskey. My species is approximately 300,000 years old in our current form, he began. But our ancestors go back millions of years before that, and for almost all of that time, we were prey. What hunted you? Vexrath asked. Everything, Kale said simply. Our world was filled with predators, and we were not particularly well equipped to deal with any of them. We had no claws and no fangs and no armor and no venom. Our young took years to mature instead of weeks or months, and we were slow compared to most other animals. Vexrath made a sound of disbelief. How did you survive? He asked. We learned, Kale said. Every predator that hunted us became a teacher whether it wanted to or not. We watched the big cats and learned how to stalk prey. We watched the pack hunters and learned how to work together. We watched the birds and learned how to use elevation and distance to our advantage. He leaned forward, warming to his subject. But the most important thing we learned was patience, he continued. We could not outrun most of our predators in a sprint, but we discovered that we could outlast them. Humans can walk and run for longer than almost any other animal on our world. So we invented something called persistence hunting. What is that? Vexrath asked, and Kale could hear genuine curiosity in his voice. We would pick a prey animal and then follow it, Kale explained. Not chasing it at full speed, but just following it, never letting it rest. Never letting it escape completely, and eventually, sometimes after hours or even days, the prey would collapse from exhaustion. And then we would kill it. Vexrath was silent for a moment. That is horrifying. He finally said, Yes, Kale agreed. And we did the same thing to the predators that hunted us. When a lion killed one of our tribe members, we would not run away and hide. We would follow that lion. We would track it for days or weeks until we understood its patterns and its territory and its weaknesses. And then we would kill it. But you said you had no natural weapons, Vexrath said. We made our own, Kale replied. We took stones and made them sharp and tied them to sticks to create spears. We took fire and learned to use it as a weapon and a tool. We took everything we learned from the predators and the prey and combined it all into something new. He met Vexroth's golden eyes. We were so afraid for so long that fear became part of who we are, he said. But instead of letting fear paralyze us, we learned to use it. Fear made us cautious and observant and clever. Fear made us work together when we would rather have worked alone. Fear drove us to invent and adapt and overcome. Vexroth set down his whiskey glass and descended from his platform, moving closer to Kale until his massive face was only a meter away. You are telling me that your species became dangerous because you were afraid, he said. I am telling you that we became dangerous because we refused to stop being afraid, Kale corrected. The Vorthani and the Sethkai and the Bracken, they all look at us and see a weak species that somehow got lucky. But they are missing the point entirely. We did not succeed despite being weak. We succeeded because being weak forced us to be smarter and more adaptable than species that could rely on strength alone. And now? Vexroth asked. You are among the stars. You have weapons that can destroy planets. Are you still afraid? Every single day, Kale said. We look up at the universe and we see how vast it is and how small we are, and we are terrified. But that terror is what drives us forward. We will never stop exploring because we need to understand everything that might be a threat. We will never stop inventing because we need every possible advantage. We will never stop adapting because the moment we get comfortable is the moment something bigger than us will destroy us. Vexroth was quiet for a long time. I understand now why you did not run from me, he finally said. You do? Kale asked. You recognized a fellow creature of fear, Vexroth said. And there was something vulnerable in his voice that Kale had not expected. Kale felt the pieces clicking into place in his mind. You are afraid of something, he said. That is why you are here. That is why the galaxy's apex predator is hiding in the shadows of a diplomatic station instead of hunting in his own territory. Vexroth's scales seemed to darken even further. There is something coming, he said. Something from the void between galaxies? My people have seen it in the darkness, and for the first time in our history, we do not know if we can fight it. He looked at Kale with those burning golden eyes. For the first time in our history, the Kethvoran are afraid. Kale reached out and put his hand on the predator's massive forearm. A gesture that should have been absurd given their size difference, but somehow felt exactly right. Then we have something in common, he said. And in my experience, fear is not a weakness. It is a warning. And the smart thing to do when you receive a warning is to start preparing. Vexroth stared at the small human hand on his arm. You would help us? He asked. I would help anyone who is willing to stand together against the darkness, Kale said. That is also something humans learned a long time ago. When the threat is big enough, old enemies become new allies. Something shifted in Vexroth's expression. You are truly strange, he said. But I am beginning to think that strange might be exactly what the galaxy needs. The emergency session of the Galactic Concord was held in the Great Chamber, a massive circular room designed to accommodate representatives from over 100 different species. Counselor Vrethan of the Vorthani had called the meeting after receiving reports of strange energy signatures at the edge of known space, and the chamber was filled with anxious delegates all talking at once. Kale stood in the observer section at the back of the room, watching the chaos unfold with practiced patience. The Vorthani were demanding immediate military action. The Sethkai were calling for further investigation. And the Bracken were arguing that whatever was coming could probably be defeated. Through superior firepower, no one was listening to anyone else, and no one was making any progress toward an actual plan. The doors to the chamber suddenly burst open, and every voice went silent. Vexroth walked into the great chamber, and the effect was immediate and profound. Delegates scrambled to get out of his way, pressing themselves against the walls and behind furniture like small animals trying to avoid a wolf. The Kethvoran had never attended a Concord session before, and his presence here meant something terrible was happening. But what shocked everyone even more than Vexrath's arrival was who walked beside him. Kale Rice, the small human observer that everyone had spent months mocking and dismissing, walked at the apex predator's side as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "This is impossible," Councilor Vrethan said, her crystal form flickering with agitation. "What is the meaning of this?" "The meaning is simple," Vexrath replied, and his voice echoed through the chamber like rolling thunder. "I have come to address the Concord regarding the threat that approaches our galaxy, and I have brought the only being on this station whose counsel I value." A ripple of disbelief passed through the assembled delegates. "You cannot be serious," the Seth Kai ambassador hissed. "That creature has no standing here. It is merely an observer from a primitive world." "Watch your words carefully," Vexrath growled, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Kale stepped forward, and despite his small size, something about his bearing commanded attention. "Distinguished delegates," he said, and his voice was calm and clear. "I understand your confusion. A few months ago, I was confused too. I could not understand why a Kethvoran would spend weeks hiding in the shadows of an observation deck watching a human." He began walking toward the center of the chamber, and the delegates parted before him almost unconsciously. "But then I realized that Vexrath was not watching me because I was potential prey," Kel continued. "He was watching me because I was doing something that no other species on the station was doing." "And what was that?" Councilor Vrethon demanded. "I was paying attention," Kale said. "While all of you were busy with your trade agreements and your territorial disputes and your political maneuvering, I was watching and listening and analyzing. I noticed patterns that your own intelligence services missed. I saw connections that your diplomats overlooked." He reached the center of the chamber and turned to face the assembled delegates. "For example, I know that the Vorthani mining proposal is actually a cover for military expansion into the neutral zone. I know that the Sethkai have been secretly negotiating with the Outer Rim colonies for a separate trade agreement. And I know that the Bracken High Command has been quietly pulling their forces back from the Galactic Edge for the past 3 months." The chamber erupted into chaos as delegates shouted denials and accusations at each other. "Silence!" Vexrath roared, and the room went quiet immediately. "The human speaks the truth," he continued. "And the reason the Bracken have been pulling back their forces is the same reason I came to this station. Something is coming from the void between galaxies. Something that even my people cannot fight alone." "This is preposterous," Councilor Vrethon said. But her voice had lost some of its certainty. "The humans have been spacefaring for barely 3 centuries. What could they possibly know about threats from beyond the galaxy?" Kale smiled, and it was not a friendly smile. "We have been preparing for threats like this since before we left our world," he said. "My species has spent thousands of years imagining what dangers might lurk among the stars. We have written countless stories about alien invasions and cosmic horrors and existential threats. We have war-gamed every possible scenario and developed strategies for situations that most species never even consider." He pulled up a holographic display that filled the center of the chamber, based on the Kethvoran migration patterns over the past 5 years. The energy signatures detected at the Galactic Edge, the unusual behavior of 17 different trading species, and the gravitational anomalies recorded by your own observation stations. I estimate that we have approximately 2 standard cycles before the first contact with whatever is approaching. The delegates stared at the display with growing horror as Kale's data painted a picture that was impossible to deny. "How did you compile all of this?" The SciFi ambassador asked, and his voice was subdued now. Because I was afraid, Kale said simply. And when humans are afraid, we do not hide or deny or pretend the danger does not exist. We study it, we analyze it, we prepare for it. Fear is not a weakness for my species. It is a tool. Vexrath moved to stand beside Kale. And the sight of the galaxy's most feared predator and the smallest delegate in the room, standing together, was something that none of the assembled beings would ever forget. Among my people, there is a tradition, Vexrath said, when another being has proven themselves worthy of hunting beside us as an equal. We use a specific word to describe them. He placed one massive clawed hand on Kale's shoulder. Brother, he said. And the word echoed through the chamber with the weight of 10,000 years of Kethvoran history. The silence that followed was absolute, Counselor. Vretham was the first to speak, and her voice had changed completely. What would you have us do? She asked. Kale looked around the chamber at the faces of beings who had mocked him and dismissed him and treated him as barely worthy of notice. I would have you do what humans have always done when faced with a threat too large to fight alone, he said. I would have you set aside your differences and your rivalries and your ancient grudges. I would have you stop thinking about which species is strongest or oldest or most important. I would have you remember that survival is more important than pride. He met the eyes of every delegate in turn. The thing that is coming does not care about your borders, or your hierarchies, or your histories, he said. It will destroy us all equally unless we stand together. And standing together means listening to voices you have ignored, considering perspectives you have dismissed, and trusting allies you never expected to have. Vexrath's grip on his shoulder tightened. The human speaks wisdom, the Kethvoran said, and the Kethvoran will stand with him. The question is whether the rest of you are brave enough to do the same. One by one, the delegates began to nod. Counselor Vretham stepped forward and bowed her crystalline head toward Kale. The Vorthani will stand with you, she said, as will the Sethkai, the Serpentine ambassador added, and they. Bracken, the four-armed warrior said. All four of his hands pressed to his chest in a gesture of respect. Kale looked around the chamber at the united species of the galaxy, beings who hours ago would not have given him a second glance, and he felt something warm spreading through his chest. Then let us begin, he said. We have a lot of work to do and not much time to do it. 6 months had passed since the emergency session of the Galactic Concord, and the united fleet of 100 species hung in formation at the edge of known space. Kale stood on the bridge of the flagship, a massive vessel that had been designed by Vorthani engineers, built by Bracken workers, powered by Sethkai energy technology, and commanded using human tactical doctrine. It was a ship that should have been impossible. A collaboration between species that had been rivals and enemies for thousands of years. And yet here it was, ready to face the darkness that was coming. Vexrath stood beside him, the massive Kethvoran somehow looking even more intimidating in the dim light of the tactical displays. The scouts have confirmed it, Admiral Chun said from her station nearby. The Void Swimmer is approaching. Estimated arrival in 17 minutes. Kale nodded and studied the display showing the approaching entity. The Void Swimmer was not a ship in any conventional sense. It was a living creature so vast that it made stars look small. A being that swam through the empty space between galaxies and fed on the energy of anything it encountered, according to the Kethvoran records. A Void Swimmer had destroyed an entire civilization in the distant past, consuming their sun and leaving their worlds as frozen monuments to extinction. And now one was coming here. Are you afraid? Vexrath asked, echoing the question he had asked months ago in his quarters. More afraid than I have ever been in my life. Kale admitted. Good, Vexrath said. Baring his fangs in what Kale had learned was a Kethvoran smile. That means you are thinking clearly. The tactical displays began flashing as the void swimmer emerged from the darkness. And Kale felt his breath catch in his throat. Nothing could have prepared him for the sheer scale of the thing. It was darkness given form. A vast serpentine shape that seemed to swallow the light of the stars around it. And as it moved, Kale could see the vacuum itself rippling in its wake. All ships. "Hold formation," Admiral Chun said, a voice steady despite the impossible sight before them. The plan they had developed over the past 6 months was comprehensive and detailed, incorporating the knowledge and technology of every species in the Concord. The Vorthani had contributed their crystalline energy matrices, which could focus and amplify power beyond anything previously achieved. The Seth Kai had developed biological weapons that could theoretically damage the void swimmers. Cellular structure the Bracken had built. Massive kinetic impactors designed to punch through the creature's hide. The Kethvoran had shared their ancient hunting knowledge, including patterns and weaknesses they had observed in similar creatures throughout their long history. And the humans had contributed something that no other species had thought to provide hope. "You know," Kale said quietly, watching the impossible horror approach. "My species has been telling stories about moments like this for as long as we have existed." "What kind of stories?" Vexrath asked. "Stories about small heroes facing impossible odds," Kale said. "Stories about brave people standing against the darkness, even when they knew they might not survive. Stories about fear and courage, and the stubborn refusal to give up even when giving up would be the sensible thing to do." He turned to look at his friend, his brother, the apex predator who had taught him that even the strongest beings in the universe could be afraid. "We told those stories because we needed to believe that courage was possible," he said. "We needed to believe that the darkness could be defeated. And now, here we are, living inside one of those stories. You believe we can win?" Vexrath asked. "I believe we have to try," Kale said. "And I believe that trying matters. Even if we fail." The void swimmer was close enough now that its presence was affecting the ships. Gravity fluctuating and sensors going haywire as the massive creature approached. "All ships, prepare to engage." Admiral Chun ordered. Kale took a deep breath and thought about all the humans who had come before him. All the ancestors who had faced predators with nothing but sharpened sticks and desperate courage. All the generations who had looked up at the stars and wondered what terrors might be waiting out there. Those ancestors had survived because they refused to accept that survival was impossible. They had fought and struggled and adapted and overcome. And they had passed that stubborn refusal to give up down through countless generations until it reached Kale, standing on the bridge of an impossible ship, facing an unimaginable horror. "First wave. Engage." Admiral Chun commanded. The United Fleet surged forward. 100 species working together for the first time in galactic history. And the void lit up with weapons fire. The battle was unlike anything Kale had ever witnessed or imagined. The void swimmer was so large that individual ships were like insects attacking a whale. But the combined assault of the entire fleet began to have an effect. Vorthani crystal weapons carved glowing wounds in the creature's hide. Sethkai biological agents spread through its system like a fever. Bracken impactors punched deep into its flesh. And Kethvoran strike teams exploited every weakness with predatory precision, and through it all, human tactical doctrine coordinated the assault, adapting to the creature's responses, learning from every attack, adjusting strategies in real time. It was persistence hunting on a cosmic scale, not trying to destroy the void swimmer with a single blow, but wearing it down, exhausting it, refusing to let it escape or recover. The battle lasted for hours. Ships were lost. Thousands of lives sacrificed, but the fleet held together. Different species covering each other's weaknesses and amplifying each other's strengths. And finally, as the void swimmer began to falter, as its movements grew sluggish and its attacks grew weak, Kale gave the order for the final assault. Every remaining weapon fired at once. A unified strike from every species in the galaxy. And the void swimmer screamed. The sound was not audible in the vacuum of space, but everyone felt it. A psychic wave of agony and disbelief as the ancient creature realized that it was dying. And then it was over. The void swimmer drifted lifeless in the void, its vast body already beginning to break apart. And the fleet held formation around it in exhausted triumph on the bridge of the flagship. Vexrath turned to Kale with something like wonder in his golden eyes. "We won," he said. As if he could not quite believe it. "We won," Kale agreed. And he felt tears running down his face. Admiral Chun approached them, her uniform singed and her face exhausted but proud. "The other fleets are reporting in," she said. "Casualties were heavy, but we survived. All of us survived together." Kale nodded and turned to look out at the stars. At the vast darkness that had seemed so terrifying just hours ago, the darkness was still there. It would always be there, but now it seemed a little less threatening. "You know what the best part is?" Kale asked. "What?" Vexrath replied. "Now every species in the galaxy knows the truth," Kale said. "They know that when we stand together, when we face our fears instead of running from them, we can overcome anything." He turned to face his brother, the apex predator who had once watched him from the shadows and wondered why he did not run. "They will never mock humans again," Kale said. "Not because we proved we were stronger or faster or more powerful than everyone else, but because we proved that strength comes in many forms. And sometimes the smallest voice in the room is the one worth listening to." Vexrath placed his massive clawed hand on Kale's shoulder. "Brother," he said. And the word carried the weight of everything they had been through together. Kale smiled and placed his own small hand over the predator's claws. "Brother," he replied. And somewhere, in the vast darkness between the stars, humanity had found its place among the peoples of the galaxy, not as conquerors or rulers, but as survivors, as adapters, as the small frightened species that had looked at the universe and said, "We will find a way."